So for our first, and I guess I would call it a warm-up, I'm going to move these just a little bit this way. And we have that nice earthy. I'm going to grab some paper. And you could use pencil, charcoal, an ink pen. You could use a brush if you wish, um, and some watercolor if you're ready to work with watercolor. So what we're going to try to do is basically this is not a watercolor sheet of paper. This is just plain sketching paper. So if you don't have sketching paper, you could just grab some printer paper, um, any type of sketching paper, because what we're going to do first is we're going to try to get in a feel, in a sense of literally doodling, sketching, illustrating, and then designing a little bit. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes trying to get accustomed to a routine, a way of, let's see what I can do. And the idea would also be to try different materials as well. So I will be showing you a couple of things. Most of you might have this. Most of you might be interested in this. Um, and then, of course, add your own ideas to it. Some of you might want to do it digital if that's a new way. So I have all these pens here. I have a pencil, a 2B. I have a mechanical pencil. I have a fountain pen with um, non-waterproof ink. I have a Faber-Castell fine liner. I have brushes. I have these water pen brushes. I have charcoal, and I have something else here, which is these watercolor pencils that you just draw your line and then bring it in some water, some wet media, will create these types of washes. So the first thing we want to do is I'm going to set up just a nice, beautiful carrot right here. And I'm going to take a look at pretty much all the parts of it. And I'm going to start with pencil. So where do we start? How do I come up with the idea to create a beautiful, is it going to be a doodle? Is it going to be a sketch? Is it going to be an illustration? Is it going to be a design? So on this page, if it were my picture plane, I want to maybe split it into 4. So I'm just going to, you know what, let me grab a little bit, something a little bit darker so you guys could see it easier. So I'm going to just divide this page in 4. And the format, very important. Am I going to be considering my format landscape or portrait? And for this, I'm going to work portrait. So I'm going to work a little bit in a vertical format where my sides are a little bit longer than the width here. Perfect. Now remember, you can work with anything right now. So my first picture plane here, I want to introduce you to a concept of, we're going to start with 1 carrot. So how would I approach this carrot? Obviously, I'm working in a portrait format. This might not be a good design. Now, could I do it across? How would that affect my composition? Generally speaking, we would go with the easiest, which would be just, I'm going to put it right in the center. I'm going to put it just at the edge, and I'm going to make sure everything fits. Would that be the easiest way? Let's go ahead and do it. I'm just going to look at the form of this carrot, and I'm hoping you guys could see it a little. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you guys could see a little more of the carrot. And again, even arranging some of these the carrot leaves here. It could be curved, it could be straight. So I want to make sure they fit into my picture here. I'm looking closer. And all I'm doing is just a quick 10, 15, 30, maybe even a minute long sketch where I begin to understand just a little bit better what possibilities, what ideas come from this. And it doesn't have to be much. It could be just like that. It could be understanding just the composition, the size. I'm going to take this same idea, 1 carrot, and I'm going to try to shift just a little bit in terms of composition, and I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and I'm going to place it not in the center, but I'm going to place it at a tiny little bit of an angle, and I'm going to look at that rule of thirds. So visually, I want to divide this into 3 segments horizontal, 3 segment vertical. And I'm going to pick one of these, and maybe this one. So I want these 2 points to be part of my composition. And I'm going to just rearrange that and have the carrot, again, looking at my sample. There's a little bit of a curve here. How far, how close to the edge am I coming around? And now that I see this, as I'm using pencil, I should have switched. And I'm going to switch to the fountain pen. Just going to go ahead and sketch with this fountain pen as I bring in some of these lines. I'm doing a lot of, I begin to do a little bit of a blind contour. This is actually a great, I'll remind you, for your next sketch. Really quick, I'm going to ask you to do something, which is go ahead and just draw a carrot without looking at your paper. So now, should my carrot leaves go this way? Or should they go this way? Something's telling me they need to go this way. So even though I have them arranged this way, visually, I would want to just have them flip the other way and maybe curve just a little bit more as they come in and around and wrap back in this way. And again, I'm not paying too much focus to the detail of the leaf, which we'll get into. And as I have these sketches, I would want to get comfortable. I'm actually going to go right into, because I used a little bit of watercolor, non-waterproof ink, I'm going to just grab a nice little warm New Gamboge, mix a little bit of color, and I'm going for that light orange color, and I just want to add just a little bit of sketched color into this. Test out which of these plain, literally off the palette, orange, yellows, reds, greens, am I gonna begin to kind of illustrate with. So this is in a sense doodling, sketching. Let's go ahead and do one more. And the idea is to begin to visualize literally on the page, free your hand, begin to let those ideas in. How do I prepare? How do I attack my first? Once I grab my watercolor paper, am I ready? Are my ideas developed enough for me to maybe discover just by accident some new way of creating a beautiful arrangement? So with this one, I'm going to go with 2 carrots. And that's for example, with this exercise that we're going to be doing today, it's going to be crucial for you to understand. You have the choice to paint 1, 2, 3, 10 carrots. What makes you pick just one? Does this look like something you would want for your composition? What happens if you choose 2? And what's the difference between 2 and 3? And how do you begin to make the decision of, wow, now that I have 3, what do I do with them? How do I place them? Are they just going to be like 3 standing straight carrots? Why not? And there is something in the mathematics of compositions where the recommendation is you either do 1, 3, or 5. And if you're doing 2, you have to consider 4. Now, don't ask me why. In the history of art, you'll see that type of arrangement, and it's a numerical arrangement where if you have let's say a portrait, there's the 1. If you have a portrait of 2, composition immediately begins to shift because you're competing with 2 images. So when you have 3, there's something that automatically balances it out. Your eye can just somehow flow. It's not bouncing from one to the other. It kind of creates that pyramid, triangular. Um, and it is hard to explain because there is a lot of psychology to it. Mathematics would explain some of it, but again, it's just one of those things that you're going to have to think about. And today we are going to do that. So you know what? I'm going to skip really quick the 3, go back to the 2, and let's see. Again, I'm just arranging these, but just as easy, you could be doing something like this. You could be doing something like this. And you're almost becoming, well, you are becoming a composer. Photographers have to think about this a lot. So in terms of composition, I'm going to have to consider what am I trying to say when I do an arrangement like this? And I'm going to go with this and a different medium. So I'm going to go with the watercolor pencil. And I'm, again, really quick. What I'm looking at mostly right now is the size, the placement in my picture plane, some of the lines that create just a little bit of engagement. What are the essential elements, forms, lines, color that are going to give this that feel? So step by step, how do I get there? This would be the easiest way for you to just almost feel like you're doodling. And you could do this over and over. Now, you don't want to make, if you have the carrots here, you want to have the space so you could arrange them. Sometimes just drop them, just like that. And I just literally grab them, lift them, drop them. And that could be, oh my God, look, accidentally, that is interesting. And if I were just to shift it a little bit this way, oh my God, I love the way this is coming around, creating some negative space, and you just doodle, doodle, and rearrange, doodle, until you begin to discover something that the word is exciting, something that you may not be able to explain why in terms of, again, the number, the angle, the composition, but it visually appealing. There is something that, in the sense, let me add a third here, of how it's coming together, it's going to work. Before we move on, I want to grab a little bit of pigment here so you guys could see the kind of experiments that we want to do. And I'm going to add some color because that's simultaneous with the line form. I also want to play with a little bit of color. And this one, I'm going to make one of those purple carrots. So all of a sudden, I'm not dealing just with line, composition, shape, texture. Now I'm also interacting with what is color going to do to my to my composition? Is this something that's going to work? And you could spend literally, and you do, if you were to take this further and much, much, much further, becoming that carrot artist, you would be doing this process of doodling, sketching, illustrating, arranging different light sources, different surfaces, different types of carrots, different types of angles, different types of views. Um, and in a way, it's kind of encouraging your creative juices. Okay, what else can I come up with? Let's do one last one here. And this one, I'm going to take one or two of these elements. In this case, I have 3 here. And what I want you to do, I'm going to show you an image very quickly, just so you could visualize. Very quickly so you can, what you see on screen. So now we're arranging one single element that it's repeated to create a pattern. And if you could see that, the number here, it almost, you could actually use this and you could see it used in, book illustrations or even textiles and all kinds of household items. So the number of them, if I stop and count them, I see 9. Is that right? Yeah. So I see 9 suggested characters, 3 that are very clear and 3 that are just at the edges of the page. So what number is, and I don't want to show you this too long, but I hope everybody had a chance to see it. Yes? Okay. So this kind of pattern or this kind of pattern, notice the difference between this one and this one. One of these two is going to make you go, ooh, a little more than the other. And I want you to just quickly sketch out with that simple idea. And for this one, I'm going to use ink. Most of us, again, looking at some of the elements, how you could bring them across. Obviously, you're gonna have to think about size, and that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna play with size. I'm gonna play a little bit with shape. So this one's a little bit longer. Here's a great opportunity for you to sketch without looking at your paper. So do a blind drawing. You know the shape. You can actually invite a little bit of accident. How long some of these leaves have to be. I'm just going to suggest them. So that's one right here. I can actually look at my paper and I'm going to just hint at this one going in this direction. So I could just simply arrange it this way, helping me visually. So it almost feels like it's going right towards this point here where they almost would meet. And you could create that little bit of tension. And again, I'm trying to draw these shapes. At this point, you could get away with um, easy blind drawings. This one, I'm going to take the opposite way. So it's going to be this end, and it's going to go this way. And it could get a little clever. So you want to be careful um, in terms of letting it become just a little too obvious or too mechanical, unless that's the goal. I'm going to do this one upwards and much, much smaller with that little bit of curve. And a much, much smaller leaf. So they're almost chaotic, but in a way, as I fill up this negative space, I begin to see clear, what is it that I'm looking for? Am I even thinking about color? What's going to happen to color? Not yet. Here I'm just focused on composition, size, line, maybe not even detail, because some of these could actually just be, let's see if you guys could see it a little clear. They could literally be like that. And let me zoom in so you guys could see better. So this literally, and let me just bring in a little bit of color, could do the job for you. Now, is that what I'm looking for? Would I be satisfied with a pattern that it almost just becomes a triangle? And it would almost simplify the form, simplify the line, and simplify the shape so much that my focus is going to be on the texture, the technique, maybe. So you don't want something that's too painterly. Like one of these that would have all the detail, and then you have a pattern with too much light. It becomes a little bit baroque, would be the word. You don't know where to look. Sometimes simple and jolly um, solves the problem. So the range for you to create infinite possibilities is literally like being in a playground. It's really taking some of these elements, and I just mentioned a few, but always referring to line, shape, value, color, texture, and in this case, pattern. So all of them are going to somehow create a composition that is going to be satisfying to you. Now, just to finish these up, I'm going to go with a little bit more yellow here. And I'm just going to add a little bit of color to this one. So throughout this entire process, you want to avoid making easy choices. Here, it is the perfect opportunity to take any and many risks in terms of color. I would invite all of you, because I know everyone here is up to the challenge. I'm going to switch this page and go to one more. We're going to do one more quick one, um, where we're going to begin to focus a little more. And here, it's an invitation to explore and experiment. Um, for example, one of them, I'm going to draw a couple of carrots with ink fountain pen, and I'm going to do it left-handed. So I want everybody to try one of those. Um, if you have an ink pen or a pencil, but do it left-handed. So now I'm using the entire page here, and I'm going to actually try to create a composition. And for this one, it's going to be just a one carrot composition. How big? What kind of composition am I going to look for? I'm going to go for this one here. Let's see. So I'm going to place this carrot like this, and I'm going to wrap around the leaf like this. No, no, still sketchbook paper. So what I want you guys to have, the reason we're doing this is you don't care. You could literally, when we're done, toss these sketches in the trash bin, because it's just like a warm up. It's like the exercise before you play the sport. These don't matter. Actually, they do matter a lot. But the the tightness that we usually approach a project like this, we want to get loose. We want to get rid of. So this one, the one I'm recommending right now, to if you're right-handed, draw left-handed and try to do a composition where we are experimenting with a new way of drawing line. So this would be mine. I'm placing my carrot all the way at the bottom of my composition, below the lower third. I'm going to make it just enough, and I'm making it almost blind contour. It's a little more focused on the actual shapes that I'm seeing. I do have a little bit of modifications to it, coming close to the edge here. But I'm focused on the quality of line. I'm focused here on how these two shapes, the carrot and the leaf, relate to each other. And I'm going to make some decisions here on how realistic or how I could simplify some of these lines, how they're going to relate to each other. I begin to see beautiful negative spaces between these little stems here that I could play with. I could begin to see how the quality of my line is going to interact with it. And I could also make decisions where I could just bring some of these. And again, I'm doing this blind, meaning my eye is on every single little point of these leaves, not on my paper. Although I have a good sense of where my pen is at this moment, I do take a peek, and it's just like a half a second, maybe a second peek to see if I'm still in the correct space, meaning in and around my composition in the paper. And I'm just not really focused on adding all of this detail. I just want to have a general idea to see how this composition would work. Now, you might have seen this in maybe movies or TV shows where you have these artists sitting at their desks and they're designing these things and they just not happy. They grab that piece of paper and they just crumble it and toss it into that little basketball trash can thing. And there's a whole pile of them. That's what these are. And you want to do dozens. Get into the sense of, oh, yeah, okay, there's something here. If there's nothing here, move on. Do the next one. And you could just flip the paper over and go for it again. Maybe you learned something that didn't work here that needs to be modified, shifted in order for it to actually work in the next one. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go really all out in terms of what could I do? And I'm going to go all the way extreme here. And I'm just going to mix a little bit of cerulean blue, a blue carrot. Yep. I'm going to go a little bit of cerulean blue. And I just took a look at my palette and my eye went straight to this color here. Now, is this going to work? I grabbed a little bit of cerulean blue and turquoise, and that's what I want to go with. So does my carrot even have to be in that orange, yellowish, reddish gamma? Not really. And I want to add a little bit of violet just here at the bottom. So this kind of experiment, this kind of sketching, what kind of green should I go for? A little earthy. Maybe mixed with this color that's already there. So all I did here in just a few seconds was to combine a type of line with a type of medium. Remember, this could have been pencil, could have been color pencil, could have been crayon, could have been brush, could have been anything you can think of, anything that's at hand. Could have been pastel, chalk, anything. And do variations thinking about line, shape, and now color. You could do combinations with texture or technique as you create some of these. Remember, we have all those beautiful techniques of wet on wet, and you could add salt or any of the other blending mediums. But very simply, without taking it too far, and I'm not saying not to be serious, you want to be as serious as possible, but still in that doodling, sketching mode um, where you can open up just the Pandora's box of creative options. And this is the way you're really going to take leaps into your own personal style because it is the way when you have, if we were to continue this, and we've been doing this for a few minutes now, for half an hour, you're going to have dozens of quick sketches and you're going to avoid that. Oh my God, what do I do now? Don't think, just let it flow. Let it flow out of your hand. Now, is this something that's going to work for me? Is this type of composition? Immediately I know, well, maybe not with these colors, maybe not in this direction, maybe not with this composition. Um, maybe I experimented a little too far, but maybe, just maybe, it could point me in a direction that is going to allow to actually get to that place, and we're going there next. So here we are. We have 2 pages taking a couple of very simple things that automatically start becoming a little more and more complex, forcing us to deal with those questions. Okay, what do I like? What looks good to me? Um, so let's hold it, pull it back a little bit. I did some here. Again, not trying to push it too far, very basic, like some of these very basic patterns where I just dab the brush on, just no pencil, no ink, just watercolor. So that's this one here. Barely any leaf. Just you could see the pattern repeating like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Barely shifting the size. A little bit of watercolor with ink. Variation of color and textures. This with the non-waterproof ink. So all these different experiments. This I did on a sheet of paper, on the back of a sheet of paper, of watercolor paper, where you do want to take some of these experiments. Once you begin to have an idea, okay, look, there's 1, 2, 3 carrots, patterns of carrots, and how am I going to deal with the background as well? So let's grab our watercolor paper now. I did 2 more samples here as well, where in a very simple way, this is not to, okay, this sounds very confusing. I'm getting lost here. No, very simply putting your element in the center so you don't have to deal with those concepts of composition. Um, that in a way, it is the one of the hardest ways of searching for new um, solutions on your own. You could simply just focus on, okay, am I going to do 1 carrot, 3 carrots, and I'm going to just place them in the center. I'm going to arrange them like this. I'm going to just deal with line, shape, and color. So that's what we're going to do next. And we're going to start with 1 carrot. So today I have 2 types of watercolor paper. I'm going to actually work this one first, which is a hot press. You might be able to see the difference. And we're going to do, I'm actually going to split this one in half, because the idea today is I want to get at least three done. So if you work too big, you're going to have to work a little bit faster. I would suggest if you have, this is a 9x12, I would probably try to fit 2 in here. Am I going to use a masking frame? Yes, I am. I might deal with a little bit of background. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to add a frame all the way around. And what is the difference between cold press, hot press? If you've never used hot press, for some of these more sketch illustration type where you're going to maybe deal with a little bit of mixed media, meaning pencil, ink line, color pencil, hot press is much more forgiving. It almost feels like drawing paper. Actually, I do use it as drawing paper sometimes. It's just heavy. It could take a little bit of abuse uh, because it's watercolor paper, but soft, velvety, where you can actually um, deliver some of that, kind of soft illustration look, where you kind of lose a little bit of that texture, where your background almost kind of disappears. You could do without. Um, so that's one of the reasons a lot of illustrators use this type of paper. You can actually draw on it easier, and your background really just, it is there and it isn't. Okay, I'm just going to take a quick measurement here to split it right in half. So that's 13. Let's make it 6.5. There we go. So I just took a ruler and I split this in half. And I'm going to have 2 quick picture planes. I'm going to be working vertically. And these first 2, I want to show you the first image that we're going to be working from. So I'm going to thank you, carrots. And I'm going to actually keep one here by my side. Now, prepping your paper and considering if you're going to have a background would be crucial here. And I'm going to try to work with this one here. So we have a vertical format. I have a nice, beautiful orange carrot, beautiful green leaves. I did email everyone this image as well, so you could take a little closer look at the detail and the shape of what those carrot leaves look like. And some of them are a little pointier, some of them a little bit rounder, and you could actually count the tips on them. And if I were to show you here one of these, Let me just pick one where you could see what they look like. There we are. You can actually see how those points and the type of composition you could do if you were to get into this type of detail. It's almost repeating that carrot shape and the curvature of it. So very beautiful. It's another option for you to get very creative um, with your line and color application as well, because they're not just green. There's that beautiful yellowish green all the way to darker bluish greens. And so I'm considering my first one, I'm going to pretty much replicate, copy what's on my screen. And I'm going to work on the left-hand side first. Um, Now for carrots, you guys just saw me. I would probably start here as I'm looking at my color wheel and work all the way through, maybe all the way here. I pushed one almost over here, and that was on purpose. And I'm sure it could still work. So anywhere around here. But today we're going to focus on from yellow. Yellow green is going to be pushing it to keep them a little bit realistic, from yellow all the way to blue violet. Okay? And anything in between here with the browns and grays as well. I had these that I also wanted to show you, where when we think of yellow, yellow, orange, and reds, and the gammas of it, any of these will work for inspiration for you to play with. Just keep these in mind. As we begin our drawing, I want to have sort of a sense of where am I going in terms of color. So the gamma that we're working with here, between any of these two colors, you could have 10, and we know that. The combination of colors from orange to red, we could easily fit 20 hue variations in there. So I'm gonna stick to these yellow oranges with a little bit of a hint of red. And I think one of the images I also sent you was this one, where you could see it. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a little bit of a echo here. There we go. Um, there we go. So you can see the variations in color. This is a beautiful photograph. Some of them look almost white, like the one all the way to the left looks almost white. And then you have these kind of yellow ochre, golden kind of brown yellows with that traditional orange. But I want you to, as you see this image here, I want you to be thinking possibilities here in terms of color. Okay? There we are. So the choices are going to be just from the earlier sketches. There's not much to this drawing. And yes, you could take this very, very far. I am going to skip the first one I'm going to make. The first attempt is going to be no drawing. So I'm going right into my water. I'm going to prepare a little bit of my color here. So my first focus is going to be color. And I think I'm going to go for a little bit of quinacridone gold. Something just, again, I go with looking at my palette, taking a little bit of inspiration, and I want to see what happens when I mix a little bit of cadmium red to it. Maybe a little more. Too much. Bring in a little more. Again, quinacridone gold. Just a nice blend. Having a nice, as always, forgot to pull one out, a test strip where we could actually begin to see a little bit of our color and our technique. So that is going to be kind of what you would expect, that traditional. And I did this with a little bit of cadmium red and quinacridone gold. And the mixture was almost 50-50. I think I pulled a little less cadmium red in there. And I think that's going to be it. That's going to be beautiful. So let me rinse my brush. I'm, again, not too worried about composition here. What I do want is a tip. Make sure wherever your carrot starts, you consider the size of the leaf, because the big mistake here would be to start your carrot right in the center and then, oh, but my leaves now don't fit. So consider that composition. Try to do it a little bit lower, and how long, how big, how fluffy your carrot leaf is going to be. So I'm going to make mine a little bit smaller. I'm going to take a little bit, just a little bit of tint, so you guys could see my first. So this is supposed to be just water, but I'm tinting it so you can actually see drawing. A little bit of a shape here. My carrot. So I'm just filling in a little bit of space. I'm preserving a little space of white that I can then kind of layer or readjust. And I'm coming right back in with pigment and doing a little bit of wet on wet. Now the ideal moment for this, as you know, according to your own technique, and I'm just touching it on. So I'm going more for a wet on wet approach. I think I'm going to tap as it's wet on wet. I'm just going to tap a little bit. Going for a little more. And I'm going to just spray a little bit of water to the side to kind of begin to hint. Make sure I get too much of this here. Adding a little more water just to these dots that sprayed here. Perfect. I'm coming back. Let me see if I can point you guys here so you guys could see it closer. I want to add clean water, so I'm adding drops of water to soften up. I want to see if you guys could see this. 1 second, please. There we go. So if you could see here, it was a little too wet, but as this dries, and I'm going to let it dry just naturally. I'm not going to assist it. Cleaning my brush, grabbing just pure water, and I'm adding drops of water to that wet on wet technique that was already there. So I'm just kind of allowing that spray that I did outside of the carrot, kind of hinting at a background. Very soft. When this dries, it's going to be very, very light. I could come again. What happens here, if you know this technique, is when you add water to water that's already there, because the new water has its weight, it's going to push that pigment and it's going to allow it to disperse. So it's going to look for that edge until it reaches dry paper, and then it's going to just create those blooms that do two things: create that nice texture and also push the pigment towards the edge. You could do a little bit of lifting, which I might do here in this area to kind of pick up a little bit more white of the paper here, because I could always come back and do a little bit of layering. Perfect. So while this dries, I'm going to go back and I'm going to just, I think I have, this is my olive green right on my palette. And I don't want it to be that simple. It's a little bit too much of a simple green. I'm going to add a little bit of chrome oxide, which is a little bit It has a little bit of cool, not too much blue in it. So I do have my pigment ready, and I'm going to do the same thing, same technique here, where I want to maybe grab a finer brush, have it ready, and I'm going to draw my leaves. So once again, looking at my image, I want just and I'm adding water, knowing that I'm going to come back when it's just a little drier and touch some pigment when it's moist. So the wet on wet technique will create that leaf texture and also some of the form. So there's my water. I don't know if you guys could see it. Let's see here. So there's the water there. You might be able to see some of it. And since I have my pigment ready, I have a little bit of lighter pigment. Add more to it. And if right now it's too wet, but if I were to touch it on there, you can see how it's going to really disperse. And it's going to maybe be a little too much. But again, it's all in experimenting. I'm adding a little bit of, I believe this was a mixture of, let's see, because it does have some brown in there. Just a little bit of a darker, browner green using some leftover pigment that was on my palette, and I'm just fluffing it, trying to kind of draw some of these stems, but I want to make sure I wait on a little longer as this paper dries just a little so it holds that form, so it's not just blobs of color. I want it to begin to look like actual texture of leaves. So in some areas it is going to be a little darker, so I want to bring it in again. And again, we could do a couple of layers of this. So this could be my first layer. And notice I'm just dotting it as I look. Here's some wet on dry. That's what it would look like eventually. And I'm trying to follow a little bit of the pattern of the leaves, which, as we said, it's almost like a 1, 2, 3. And they look like, resemble a little bit the shape of the carrot with a little bit of curve. You could also think of it as fingers, kind of like a little glove. And I think this is going to need to dry for the second layer. So far, so good. I think I'm going to add a little bit of gravity to this because there's a little too much settling up here. So I'm going to tilt it to the right and down to the side. As you can see, this nice section with water and pigment. Because of the paper, I guess the way it was settled, it buckled into the center. It's a little too much. I wanted to have a little chance to have more pigment on this side. But right there, we have one composition, one carrot, and it was just watercolor on paper. I'm going to let it dry as I work on the second one. Because these you definitely want, yes, you could bring in a blow dryer and help it assist. I did some samples and I actually had the chance to let them dry, come back and do the layers naturally as they just dried, air dried naturally. There's something about it. I don't know if it's me, but there's something about it when you come back and do your second layer, when you let it naturally dry, the pigments somehow respond to me much richer. It is a little bit richer. Um, Before we move on, I'm going to add just a little more. One touch of pigment right up here and right down here. So I go a little more towards the cadmium red area And I'm just touching it before. Now that it's still very wet, somewhat wet, but I want it right at that moist. So I'll keep an eye on it. But meanwhile, we can work on a second one. So I hope you have this image. If you're still working on it, keep going. I'm going to move to carrot 2, and we're going to work in the same way. Now remember, as we look at this image, you could be thinking like this. If not, you can do what I'm about to do, which is just try to replicate what's there. So we're doing from 1 carat composition, we're going to go to 2 carat composition. And this one, I am going to use pencil or ink. You're welcome to do a nice pencil drawing. So the idea today is that we're dealing with color, we're dealing with line, we're dealing with composition, and how to just turn this beautiful subject and discover all the possibilities. What are the formulas, really? Here we're going to add a little bit of pencil drawing and see how that affects, see if we like that. We should know already. Notice that in the composition, if I were to split this into halves, this is a little bit off center. So I'm going to push it a little bit to my right, maybe even a little more than it's actually on the picture frame here, on the reference photo. And I am going to make them maybe a little bit smaller so I have more room for the leaf up above. And I'm going to just do my drawing. Very loose, very light. Here's a great chance again to do some blind drawing. A little bit of blind contour drawing. Trusting your sensibility. And adding a little bit of risk. If you haven't done it before, you should really give it a chance when you work on your sketches. And you'll see that carrots are very forgiving when you draw them blind. They still look like carrots. Sometimes they look even more like a carrot, honestly. Sometimes we try to force our line, making the carrot look like a carrot, but if you do it blind drawing, somehow I love the quality of that line. I'm just going to hint at how big this is going to be so I get a sense of how far. I love the curves on this leaf here that kind of resemble here at the bottom, so I could play with a little bit of that. And then I'm going to place my second carrot right here. Just like we see in the image. It's going to go a little bit lower. There's that nice, beautiful negative space there. Obviously, I want to plan ahead. If this is something that I don't want to deal with in my technique, you either want to put them closer together or more space. It would be a question of which serves you better. I'm going to try to emulate that. And I'm going to try to capture this beautiful curve that we have right here at the bottom. I think it's a beautiful feature of this carrot, that nice root. Very playful. And I had a quote that I had ready for this class today, which is, if there is a goal for this class today, is for you to give your carrot a persona, a personality. Here, I'm giving this carrot a couple. They're a couple. And they're in love. So there you go. That kind of feeling that you can bring into an object. Adding a little bit of extra creativity. Now, if you weren't willing to do, let me focus a little more because it does look a little bright. I'm going to zoom in so you could see the lines a little bit better. If you didn't try the blind drawing on your carrot, which I did here, and look, you have these nice curves that form, if you could see that. The perfect opportunity is when you do these leaves. You really don't need to look at your paper. And I'm not. I'm looking at the screen and I'm just really giving myself, because this could be a beautiful part of this composition. The type of drawing, the type of pencil line that you add to the character of this leaf could be spectacular. So blind drawing would be one way. And I don't know if you could see it. Let me zoom in a little bit more. Let me go a little bit lower. Oops, too much. Okay. It looked a little too bright. There we go. So notice the quality of this line already. It actually does emulate, it kind of begins to really relate to what I'm actually looking at. And it's not perfect, but it's just, again, because I'm trying to blind contour this part of the subject, and I'm going really slow. I want to go a little bit slower. I'll take a peek every now and then in order to get some of that proportion, but you could really spend a couple of minutes here and make this a high focal point, which already is making me very excited. Like, oh, this could be really good. Once I add a little bit of color, there's already a good foundation in this drawing, in this line. And one of the things that we've been dealing with in a lot of classes is finding that personal balance of line and color. If we're working with color, how am I going to balance my line with that color? And again, depending on which type of line you're working with, when we're working with ink and watercolor, it's different than pencil and watercolor. So there's that to consider. How you bring in color, again, thinking of which type of technique. They're just layers and layers of variations that you can begin to manipulate in order to create your personal style. One that really makes you happy. In the end, that's the goal. It makes you happy. And it allows you to continue to experiment and push further. Maybe it challenges you. So there we go. They merge right here. So these carrots, at the end of the day, you'll be able to give them names. That's the idea. And again, not rushing these lines. As I look at this, I'm going to take a little pause here because I was waiting for this to be moist, and it looks like it is right at that stage. I'm going to grab my brush again, a little bit of smaller brush, with a little bit of that pigment, and I wanted to just add a little second layer right at this edge. And notice how well that's taking it in right now. Let me zoom in so you can see it. Right here, if you see, I was waiting for, oops, 1 second. There we are. If you could see, waiting for this perfect ideal moment right here. Notice the dispersion of the pigment that I'm bringing in. So the amount of water and pigment that I'm bringing in, I want to create, it's kind of not a second layer, it's like a 1.5 layer because it's still in the first stage where there's moisture on the paper. And I was waiting for this ideal moment of wetness to bring in a little extra pigment. And the amount of dispersion that you see here is exactly what I want for my technique that I'm looking for, where you still get a little bit of that granulation. I'm going to soften up some of these edges by adding a little more water. And as I have a little bit of that moisture, add a little more pigment I don't want to overdo it as I look at my subject and I see areas where I'm becoming more and more familiar with my own personal technique, and I know that this is the right amount at the right time. And one last one down here, just to blend these two. And here it's still a little bit wetter, so you're going to get a little more dispersion. But it almost begins to look finished. Now I want to maybe touch up a little bit also here on the greens. It might be drier because it was, yep. So it is already dry. So this is almost a wet on dry because there was less moisture. I added much, much less water here at the top. So if you look at this area here, it's pretty dry. It's damp, still damp. So let's go back to our drawing. Move these a little bit out of the way and continue with our drawing. Now, I'm getting carried away and I'm spending maybe a little too long on these. And that's usually what I do. But you get the idea. This drawing could be the focal point. And for me, it was. Now, some of the lines that I might want to bring in here, again, we're dealing with composition is done. We got it. As I continue developing whatever happens up here, let me just do one final one up here. I'm considering color, but the line is going to be a huge factor. Negative space as well. What that line creates in terms of a little bit of value differences, the refinement, the shapes, but negative spaces, especially somewhere in between here and some areas in here, they're going to be crucial. So you could play with all of that. Now the darkness of the line here as well, and the softness of it. Perfect. So this is more a traditional way of approaching a watercolor, and we might be very familiar with this. We do our pencil drawing, and then we watercolor, and we only focus on, once again, color and technique. So for this one, let's see, we will go a little more traditional. So I'm going with my round brush. Now colors, are they going to be the same color? Let me show you once again for inspiration. As I look at this really quick, I think I'm going to make one yellower, the other one a little bit redder. So as we look at our spectrum, and again, I have all these here. You could do this the same way. You have your reference, which if I were to use this, I could stick with that. That's kind of what I was going for with the first one. But again, we're experimenting. You don't have to do it the way I'm doing it. You could really stick with the colors that are on the screen. But I want to see if I get a little bit of inspiration from looking at these colors. And this is that little bit of extra that it takes. Something is pulling me towards these redder, kind of reddish brown. And maybe reddish brown orange would be the way to go. Maybe you could just go from yellow to purple. That would be one. And usually I would go that way. I like pushing boundaries, limits. I know this green is going to play really well. Maybe that's what's telling me to go with more reddish. The red and the green are going to be obviously complementary. So I'm going to play with the orange that I had here, that cadmium red, quinacridone gold. And I might add just a little bit of alizarin. See what happens. Obviously it cools. But yeah, that's a nice, beautiful red there. And you guys can't see it. Let me hide this for a second so you can see my palette. What's happening here? So I had a little bit of leftover from the first picture, the orange. orangey color, which was quinacridone gold with cadmium red. And I just added a touch of alizarin crimson. And I think this, I got to go for this look here. Maybe I'll have a little bit of spectrum with New Gamboge down here where I could just maybe tone it down in certain areas. But I do like that reddish violet, almost going towards violet feel. And I think these two will make a good match. And then for my green, I might move over to a little bit of a cooler green. Something like a perylene green with maybe a mixture of that chrome that I had earlier. And again, testing it, seeing it on your test strip. You can actually grab all of the colors here and you can begin to see what that would look like. And there you go. I think this would work for me. This one's very similar to the first. And you can actually play as you develop. The question here is, I did wet on wet, so this one I'm going to do wet on dry. I'm going to start with this larger. And I want to preserve some. Oh, let me show you guys the image again. There we are. Nope, not that one. This one. I want to make sure I preserve maybe a few whites, maybe start with a lot lighter first layer and preserve whites on this edge. Now I am kind of tapping, dabbing the edges of the brush where you almost get the edges formed to preserve, even with the shape of it, some of those whites, if you could see that. So you almost begin to get the volume of the carrot. And again, I'm still working wet on dry, but I'm bringing a little bit of wet on wet now. I don't want too much white. I want it to make sense, meaning the light is coming from this side. So we're going to add a little more pigment, maybe a little additional color to the opposite side. And just, let's do that now, bring it in. As we work wet on wet, there are certain areas here. Just making it a lot redder. Maybe it does need a touch, just a touch of a blue that would really, I'm going to mix it on the paper. So I grabbed a little bit of phthalo blue and I'm going to add it right here at the edge. Ooh, very deep. I'm going to lift a little bit, rearrange that pigment just to the edge without lifting too much. It almost becomes shadow right away. Not sure if these pigments are doing exactly what I wanted. But again, it's first layer. We could always come back. Being a little cautious. I'm going to go to the second one. And again, wet on dry. Preserve some of the whites. And here you're working on your brush. Maybe use a different brush to create some of these blank negative space shapes that we will play with just in a few minutes. And you can begin to see the shiny effect, the shift in color that points at the direction of the light. Bring in a little darker tone, a little more pigment to the edge, the opposite edge. And I'm doing that with wet on wet. Beautiful. Very, variations in technique. Um, this is a nice way to play and, again, experiment with a mixture of them. I'm going to go with this mixture of Perlin green, and I believe it was olive green that I had on my palette. And I'm just, again, wet on dry. I'm going to start right at the base. Dab it on. Maybe allow a little bit of touching. In some of these areas where we have a lot of negative space, I want to play with a different variation of technique. I'm kind of drubbing and scrubbing my brush to create some of that same effect to complement the drawing. So notice how when I drag, the bristles of the brush kind of do this nice little dance, and they drag the pigment, and they kind of create these beautiful leafy shapes, really, and some of that negative space that I was looking for. But also notice how there's more pigment in certain areas, and as I drag and pull the brush, you're almost like sweeping it, so it'll collect, and it'll also create this enhanced variation in value, grabbing a little more pigment that I could really play with. And again, the question always is, how far do I want to take this? Do I really want to turn this into hyper photorealistic carrot? Yeah, we could do that. But we're starting basic. We're starting with a little more. Again, this is not a doodle. It's not a sketch anymore. It's somewhere between a sketch and a drawing as we do a color study. So I would call it that, a color study more than anything. But it could easily become a painting. And as I progress, I'm again dealing with questions of, now I have line, I'm dealing with color, I'm going to focus on value changes in some of these leaves, and I go to my reference photo for this. But I'm also thinking about technique. Which kind of technique is going to serve the purpose best here? Do I even have a plan as far as what that final look? So I'm going from wet on dry to wet on wet, and then I'm adding water to the wet on wet, softening some of these edges, and sometimes right in the middle of the pigment to create more dispersion in that pigment. And this you have to just allow time to deliver that technique. You could use that spray technique, spatter. There we go. Bring in a little extra pigment. And I'm going to have to wait on this one as well in order to bring it back in a second layer, as these pigments, these colors, show me a little more. Just as the first one is ready, I'm going to go back. And I wanted to show you a quick technique. I almost want to leave this alone and really give it a little more time, because it's kind of a look that it takes a lot of patience to just leave alone, take it all in, give it a little breathing time, and maybe anything you add to this, it's very cautious, because to me this is done. Here we could add just a few, and I think spatter would be the proper technique for here at this point. So I do have a toothbrush here. I have some of that same pigment. I'm going to test it here first. There you go. I like that kind of spatter. And I'm just going to very close. I think it needs a little more pigment. So I'm going to bring in a little more of that alizarin crimson. Mix it with a little bit of cadmium red. And it's not necessarily a darker value, it's more pigment. It just needs more pigment. Bring it back in. Test it. Yep. There we go. As I consider, so I want to give you guys a close-up here. What some simple touches, simple things can actually say way more. And with the leaves, if I were to, this is the look that I love here for the leaves. So you notice that was wet on wet, and then I touched areas with wet on dry, and I let them bleed in. Where that edge, it's very hard to draw or paint. It's only the water and the pigment that can do that if you allow them to. Same is happening here. Notice that with wet on dry and bringing in back wet on wet and areas of it, just playing with the amount of pigment and the volume and the value of it, letting them do the drawing, letting them, the water and the pigment, create that texture, not us trying to force it. Before we move on to the last one, and I do want to get into the last one, which is our pattern. And that one I'm going to probably have to do quick, is bring back a little bit of extra pigment. And here I'm going to bring in I wanted to bring that bluish tint to complement these. So we have these white areas of negative space that give us that light. And I might come back and revisit some of them with a tiny light wash of the same color to take off just a little bit in certain areas of that white, because it does seem a little too white or too much of it. So I'm actually rinsing my brush and getting a little bit of that pigment, and I'll show you here. See if I could switch camera. Maybe move it here. There we are. So if you see this, in some of these areas here, I want to just maybe add a little layer and dull, just a touch, some of that white. Just a little bit. There we go. And I might do the same with just areas of this. Creating nice little spots, but not such big. I think I left, for the size of them, just a little too much. So as this dries, it'll look a little bit lighter, and I think that'll work still as light, and it'll be in the value, in the color of that carrot. I said I'm going to try ultramarine blue this time. I think the phthalo was just a little too much. And yeah, that automatically creates a little more kind of purplish feel, a little bit of violet. And I'm going to bring that wet on dry just to the back of the side here. Have it ready. Maybe a little more blue. Play with a little bit of the form of the carrot, bring it all the way down. And that automatically, as well, complements that nice bright orange. Have some of your pigment ready. And what I want to do now is soften up that edge. Just the edge. Perfect. Now, how much detail do I need to come in for all the elements, all the lines of that carrot? I'm going to do the same. I'm going to let these complement each other. Not so much with the drawing. We have a nice, beautiful pencil drawing that still shows. I'm going to let the color do more of that drawing. What do I mean by that? You have these lines that, notice certain areas like this here. You create different layers, and it almost looks like new lines over the pencil lines that I want just as well to begin to happen here instead of having to draw them. So once again, we go back to essentials. How do I say something without having to make it obvious and have to draw those lines on the carrot when I can actually let the pigment in the water do it for me? And it says it much, much more eloquent. So my idea is going to be ink and washes, and I'm going to do both. Now, remember at the beginning, a pattern requires more than one, maybe more than two, more than three, but it could be patterns of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It could be patterns of 1, 2, 1, 2. It could be patterns of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So all the arrangements and the possibilities as you begin to think of composition, as I always say, best way would be to sketch out a couple of ideas and let that speak to you. Here I'm going straight with ink. I'm going to use regular fine liner. It's a little bit small maybe. I'm going to go with a little bit bigger. Let's see how this one works. And I'm getting a sense of, as I start, I'm looking at these carrots and the shape of them. I'm going to keep them smaller, but I am looking at all the carrots that are on screen, and I'm taking random inspiration in terms of form. So this might have a little more of an illustration feel to it. And I'm going to minimize the lines of the leaves. So I want to make sure my pattern doesn't get too overwhelming. So I'm just adding a couple of little marks here. And it's almost like a 1, 2, 3 fluffy with some negative space. And I'm going to do this, thinking of direction, beginning to do a little bit more of a chaotic. This one is going to be a little rounder. So as I see on screen, one of the yellow ones, and a little bit thicker. And again, you can do variations on the leaves. That's part of the game here. And I just had an idea, which let's see how it works. I am going to make my pattern, as I was saying earlier, there are going to be lots of carrot couples. So it's going to be a 1-2 pattern. They're going to be all 1, 2, 1, 2. And I'm looking at the lines upside down. They're going to pretty much match somewhat color and shape, maybe. I'm not there yet, but as I look at this, it starts working for me. Now, notice what I'm doing here. The direction of these leaves are going this way. Should these follow or should these go the opposite way? I think they're going to follow. Just visually, somehow, I don't know where that answer comes from, but you do see that once you can, let me see 1 second. There we are. Everybody can see okay? Perfect. I can consider all these variations in color. I'm really thinking about form. So I got to start thinking about direction as well. So I have somewhat of a diagonal angle. I have a little bit of a diagonal, slight diagonal going on here. So I don't want to make all of them kind of repetitive directions. This one, since this was going this way, this one would be maybe horizontal, too much, too close, so halfway in between, or maybe just vertical. And I'm also considering negative space as well. So the space between the pairs, I'm going to add two of them here. Two little just carrots that just come right up here at the top. And that's going to fill up this space here. And once again, I'm taking inspiration from the screen as I see that coming together. So notice how these went just right into the frame. And I could have maybe a carrot automatically points me in this direction, going off and coming in with a little bit of a curve right into here. And you could turn your paper so you're not drawing upside down carrots if you're not used to it yet. And the pear, which would be right next to it. So it doesn't have to be too complex. Remember, solution, simplify is always a good way to go. In terms of lines, now, I just realized something. I said I was going to do ink first, washes after, and I just realized I got carried away. And it might be because I'm might be rushing a little bit because I kept you guys so long today that I just really didn't think it through. So I could have the upper part of my composition with ink, then wash, and now I'm going to go to the bottom and I'm going to do washes first. So here I need a clean palette. So I'm getting an intuitive sense that I want to do it here and here. And I'm going to do it with washes. So those two first washes are going to be very violety. Now, what kind of violet? I'm going to go with quinacridone red. So I'm going more for a purple. And I'm going to mix a little bit of ultramarine blue. And I just love that. This might be too blue. My ultramarine is very soft right out of the tube. So I need more quinacridone red. And somewhere in between here, I think that's the one I'm looking for. And I saw some of your works had these beautiful colors. So I'm going to make this a big piece of it. Okay, so I have my color. That's going to be it right here. Maybe it's still a little bit too violety. So I'm going to have a little, just extra range. There you go. And I'm going to now consider what I was mentioning before, size, but I'm also considering technique. How am I going to apply this wash? Is it going to be wet on wet? Is it going to be wet on dry? Whew. That's where that's what's exciting about this. You could just go in a multitude of directions and you're always going to pretty much be right. So I'm thinking I'm going to do one wet on dry. Now I'm thinking of direction. I have these going down. I have these going up. So I'm going to have these going the opposite direction here. And I'm going to have one. Remember, we're not drawing the carrot. I just got to get a sense of it. If you're going to leave some whites, I want to just bring down the value a little bit, and 2. Now, what I didn't consider there, and again, I'm rushing. I should have the greens. And again, these greens I guess are going to be smaller. So they are touching. So that's 1, 2. And the other one is going to be upwards. And they're going to be much smaller. Just a wash, 1 and 2. I want to bring in a little bit of water because I think these flat washes are not going to be just what I want. So I'm adding a little bit of water, drops of water. Oop, too much. That actually could be nice. And maybe going off of it. I think one of you mentioned, Gretchen, maybe you spray it if you have it. Just a little spray there could create something extra interesting for that wash. And I think already I could start seeing it. Yep, that's much better than what I had there before. Just a flat wash. Not too interesting, but it's still light enough where I could come back with my line and it'll be balanced. I'm lifting just a little bit, expanding just some of the edges. There's a little bit of spattered, accidental maybe from that spray bottle, and I love it. So that already starts looking interesting. Now I'm going to go to my reddish orange. So I'm going with New Gamboge, and I'm going to use Pyrrole Red. That should be a nice complement for this warm. And I'm going to create another wash right here, and these are going to be horizontal. So this one, I'm going to do wet on wet. So I'm going to just wash tint on there, and a second one right there. And again, they're touching. So one's going this way, the other one's going the opposite way. I'm going to add one more wash, kind of to even it out. And this one's going to be a little bit yellower. So I'm grabbing some cobalt yellow, and I'm picking up just a little bit of that orange I mixed earlier. And I'm going to add these right here. And this one, I'm going for a full wash. So I'm just adding pigment to this whole area, and I'm not even going for the shape of carrot. You'll see what happens here, because it's just going to be a drawing right on top of that wash, and you still get away with it. I kind of referenced that earlier. So this one, before I forget, it was turning too much again into a flat wash. I want to make sure I add a little bit of technique or texture, something to it. I think what it needs is a little bit of lift. And I'm going to do it right through the middle with the edge of my paper towel, like that. And just a little bit more on this side, a little bit more, a little bit finer. So I got to be a little careful. Just a touch. There we go. I think I need one last one. I'm looking at the negative space. I'm going to do a little bit of wash, just add some water right here. And I'm just going to go with cadmium red and a little bit of that leftover orange I had there, and just dab it on. Let gravity do some of it. And I think I'm going to bring in some of that color just right there and maybe right here. So this is where you really get to test out all of your techniques, see how far you could push them. Now, should I do the washes for these first? I'm actually going to let these dry, and I'm going to go into the color of what we were talking earlier, the ink drawings. I'm going to give them a little breather because I need to see what the greens are going to do for me. So I'm going to stick with a pretty much monotonous kind of, I don't want to over saturate the colors here. So I'm going to go with light washes of just kind of like a first layer. This is olive green. And remember, I don't have to stay within the lines here. They're almost like washes with those lines as kind of a guide. You want to get a little bit kind of sketchy. Remember, you're dealing mostly with line color balance, but mostly at this point with technique. What can you do with technique, layering, and obviously still involved with color. I'm going to do this one wet on wet. And I'm keeping it very light. I want the greens kind of to be there, but not call out too much attention. I like that wet on wet, so I'm going to do this one wet on wet as well. And maybe all of them will be just wet on wet, keeping some of it very simplistic and just a second layer with a couple of value changes. Maybe just a few lines added from those layers as texture. Okay. Now I have to consider the color of these, and I'm going to go a little bit lighter towards the yellow. And that would make, I believe, these violet. Remember, keeping some of the whites. And in a sense, you get some, like, oh, ease. Not overthinking it too much, but noticing where you actually have to place your focus. Was it in the color coordination? Was it in the placement coordination? I think I'm dealing with something here that, oops, and it could just probably turn out green. This actually is going to fill it up. So that's one way. I'm going to go a little bit cooler yellow with a little bit of cobalt, and I'm going to revisit wet on wet. So more water first. And obviously your value, saturation is going to play a part in this pattern. The lighter you keep some of them, you can bring opacity up and down. I'm going to do these wet on wet as well. A little bit wetter. And I'm not staying inside the lines. They're kind of just dropping in the color. And I'm getting a feeling that something really needs to happen with the background now. And it might be just shadows. That might do the trick. So I definitely like the wet on wet more than the just wet on dry feel, because I love how these look as compared to these. Much, much better. I'm going to do a couple of washes here for these. So we have no line yet, but I'm still considering, knowing that there is going to be some line. I don't want to overdo it. Just add a little bit of that here. So yeah, definitely I'm more of a wet on wet person. I don't want to maybe overdo it. Considering now just areas of negative space, making some of these leaves a little bit lighter and a little bit smaller, because I think that was big part of consideration for your pattern. And this looks like I just went to the supermarket, looked at the carrot section. But again, it's stage one. This will point me to a lot of positive things for next time, as I see things that I like and see things that I can improve on. What you can come up with, I'm dying to see. Because this is a really fun exercise where you really have to ask a lot of questions. Here I'm getting a little more saturation. And for these two, I might switch up a little bit of green. I'm going to go with a little bit darker. Still wet on wet. And these I'm just going to blend in right into this one as well. Blend them maybe just underneath it. So you can begin to mix and play with the pattern, how they interact with each other. And yeah, it just keeps going right underneath this one, right over it there. And last one is right here. Should I do it this way or this way? And I think they're just going to be this way. Very small greens. And two more. Got to be careful because this one's still wet. But I'm just going to insinuate the greens right there and right there as they just hide underneath this carrot here. Wow. And yeah, should take a little longer, should take a little more time with it. I feel maybe now I'm looking at it, I rushed it a little bit. We do need this to be fully dry in order for us to begin drawing the lines over the wash. So while I wait for that, I'm going to revisit with a smaller brush and add that second layer of green by adding just a little bit of extra pigment and maybe a shift in value. So I added just a touch of pearling green to my olive green that I had previous there, and just touching wet on wet some of these lines as I get in and out through some of these areas. Don't want to get too mechanical, still taking advantage of this moist, wet stage. If it's not, I want to add a little bit of moisture, soften these edges, get that nice quality of watercolor line, which you all did earlier. But yeah, this little change in contrast with the greens, I think it's already doing much, much, much better. And again, your limits for experimenting are just however far you want to go. You tell yourself, that's it. That I don't want to go further than this. But in terms of experimenting with technique, with color, only you set limits. You set your own limits. And this is the perfect opportunity to push those limits. And I kind of was trying to do that. So again, it's a risk. We could always play it safe, but it's very exciting to see, okay, what would happen if I added, a different color, different layer, different technique. In this case, a different type of pattern. A different idea, maybe shape. I have nice areas here where I want to make sure I catch them before they dry. And I can really begin, if I haven't done this before, begin to visualize how, if you did wash first, ink after, if you've never done it before, you're going to need the opportunity, the chance to see what it looks like now and what you need to kind of been there before experience of, okay, this is where it needs to be next time, now that I'm going to add lines. So you won't know until after you did it, which only improves next time you do it, if that makes any sense. So what I'm trying to say is I'm visualizing how much color I need to add here, knowing that I'm going to come back with line. So it's going to be tiny little bits of line if I added too much color. And if I don't, then I'm going to have to add more line because of the lack of texture or technique or color. But already I could see very promising things here. I am going to really quickly grab my heat gun. Gotta come all the way around these cameras with all these wires. There we go. And I am gonna give it a little bit of air just to speed it up one touch. Although I do really recommend when you're working like this to let it maybe have a separate project and set it aside and let it fully dry naturally. Maybe it's me. It just feels completely different. I guess it's kind of like coffee. Some people like their coffee a certain way if it's too toasted or not toasted enough or too fine. For me, this does something to the pigments. And it's not the heat, maybe it's the way they speed up to settle, maybe. I can sense it. I can feel the difference. But again, maybe it's just me. And I most definitely, as I look at this, I will have to bring in some light blues maybe right underneath, in the background. Not much. They might be not necessarily shadows, but they'll almost insinuate shadows of maybe a very light kind of cerulean blue. There we go. So this is what we have so far. So I'm going to start with these. I'm going to switch over here. And I'm going to use the same pen I used earlier. There we are. Which was this fountain pen. And this is crucial. How much line? I need to be looking at a subject in order to make decisions. And the one thing I don't want to do here is just outline that beautiful wash we already have there. So you have to kind of feel comfortable with just adding the same type of line that you did for the earlier drawings, taking advantage of some of these washes. And again, notice that I'm doing broken lines. I am not doing all the way silhouette. I'm just doing a line where I think it needs it. I could go inside of it, outside of it. Notice here. Let me see if you guys could see this. Even all the way outside of the wash. Sometimes I use different dots here, for example. It's not just the same quality of line. So if you could see that right here, I'm going to see this wash. Let's see a little bit better angle. There. If you notice, there's a nice break in the pigment. So I might just want a nice cap here, suggesting. And this is completely intuitive, but avoid the urge to want to just, contour it, like silhouette it. And the recommendation is you have to almost be looking at that subject. You can't just make this up. You eventually will. You'll definitely be able to. Adding some lines here to the greens. Let me show you another example. I'm going to go to these actually right here, which were my two little tiny finishing. Now this one's going to be really tricky. I'm going to go switch over to a super fine, a very tiny, tiny one. Let's see, this one might work. So I pick a 0.1 pen, fine liner again. And these lines could be just simple hints to complement the color that's already there. Did you guys see that? I'm going to go ahead right into this shape here. And notice, all I need to do is hint with broken line. And sometimes when you are not sure, it's best to just leave it alone. You'll be fine. Adding a couple of dots, not just broken lines. Maybe even a variation of line. But again, notice how I'm respecting the wash, giving it a little bit of his own personality, following that contour and coming in and out of it. If you guys can see that. That'll do it. So that was switching to a fine liner, much finer point. Let me go back to this view here. I'm going to go to these two big ones here. Once again, you want to go, oh, I love this edge here, so I almost don't even want to touch it, and I won't. And this one, I'm just going to make sure they come in. I'm almost hinting more at the indentations. And this one, I might just right inside of it. I guess just insinuating, hinting at it. Sometimes even surrounding an area of color that doesn't even have a wash. Here I almost recommend doing blind contour as you're looking at the screen. Pick an area of leaves. And again, don't overdo it. Remember, it's about keeping the balance. But let me zoom in just as I do this so you could see it. And it's almost like scumbling. But I am looking at leafy parts, leaving some. I'm going to move to these two here. They have almost a beautiful shape already. Adding just dots, broken lines, almost scumbling, insinuating, enhancing would be the key word here, where it needs enhancement. Where I have nice shapes and watercolor lines, edges already, I don't want to overpower it um, it would be like screaming. You want it more like whispered. And just making sure you make decisions with that word in mind, enhancing what you already have there. It could be very simple, just dotted lines. Again, I remind you the temptation to just want to overdo this is a crucial one. I could always revisit it and add little extra layered dots of color here and there that would even bring this to a new level. And I think that's it for line so far. Maybe some here as I look and scan through, wanting to add some negative space, because I know here I could, again, easily overdo it. Just a couple lines would be maybe too much. when instead I could just add a couple of washes of value changes and have maybe a more powerful result. So I was making sure I was working with waterproof ink. And at this stage, I just want to revisit. Do I have to? Not necessarily, but I want to just enhance the look. In some of these cases, just a couple touches, and I'm doing wet on dry. I should stick to a little bit of wet on wet by adding a little bit of moisture and bringing in a little bit of extra pigment somewhere in these areas where now we have line, and by adding just a couple of touches of variation of value, you begin to understand how, with technique, with line, with color, value changes, you can enhance and begin to give character. And take this just a little bit further. Maybe a little bit of lifting here. I think I overdid it right there. Without getting too carried away. Most of the work I think I want to do is in the area of greens here. So one way I could do that is easily use this mist, fine mist, water sprayer, and I'm going to just add a mist to every green, and it's very fine. So I just added a tiny little layer of water mist. I do have some darker value, more pigmented green, and I'm just going to touch it so it's full wet on wet. I don't want to get too robotic, too mechanical, too automatic. Where I'm going to add these, I want to make sure I'm looking at my reference somewhat in order to make sense of it. Obviously, I'm looking at my picture as well, where I actually need some of that value change and where I don't, how much of it. And notice that that nice little fine mist creates a nice little effect. But I like to add just a little extra water on the edges or sometimes right on top, softening some of these lines so there's variation once it dries of that layering. Getting a little closer to the edge. And I start liking the look. Maybe it's, again, carefully not getting too carried away. Since I have that nice fine mist, I'm going to grab a little more yellow, New Gamboge, add a little bit of water, and revisit some of these lines as well. Adding a little bit of color gradation, value changes, softer edges, and somewhat variation of technique. And these little spots, like I just added a little vibrant red here, just pure red, pyrrole red. That's going to match up against this green beautifully, and it might merge with it. That's totally fine. Soften up the inner edge. And I think that's it. That carrot is done. And would you agree? Totally looks, unless I deal with something in the background, I think that is where we want to get to. Adding just a few more touches here and there. And again, at this stage, you have to be very cautious not to take it too far too quick because there's already a lot of information. I want to move to a smaller and smaller brush. And usually the tendency there is to add more and more detail. And that's actually what you want to stay away. Notice here, I just add 2 dabs of color. Right, I just lay down the brush with a little tiny bit of pigment, a little bit redder at the top. And I'm going to do the same right at the bottom. Just lay down the brush with a little bit of pigment. I'm going to add a little water to that, and I'm just going to run it right here through the side and right through this side as well. So I'm just dotting it in. There we go. Very cautious. I keep saying it. It's just one tiny little misstep that pushes you to want to add more information than you need. And now this water spray that I did earlier is perfectly at that moist stage. So notice how it just very slow expanding dispersion, adding a little more water to it, creating some of those nice technique edges, working all the way down. Variations with this green. I'm just worried about the layers now. And little by little, I'm going to do this to every single carrot that I see here. Wet on dry, and then soften up that edge by adding a little runny water. And then wet on wet. So manipulating the pigment, the water, in order for it to, it's in the end, it's discovering the versatility of your own technique. A little more pigment for our green. There's already a lot of line here, but I'm going to make this one a little bit, change the rhythm. So this one's a little bit darker, a little fluffier. Therefore, I need to just bring in a little more of the same to balance it out right here. Just little touches of it. Adding a little bit of moisture. And then running a little bit of wet on wet with extra pigment. And I look for some of that line. Just like my line enhanced the color, now the color is seeking to enhance the line. So I look for areas just like that without painting. Notice that I'm just dabbing small areas of color. And it's that subtle dance of line enhance color, color enhances line, and back and forth, back and forth. I'm seeking a little more contrast. This one I'm a little nervous, but I'm going to add a little bit of water and just a touch of pigment right there, right there. Just making these pop up a little longer, right at the stem, right where they meet. And this worked out so beautiful in technique. I'm almost afraid to touch it, but I'm just going to add one little run. Oops, too much. That's not what I was looking for. Just a middle. A run right through the middle. And right through the middle of this one. Trying to give it a little extra volume. Lifting a little bit. So all of the facets of your technique, you're putting to the test. A couple more. I'm going to probably do a variation. Adding a little bit of moisture, just a little bit. As I prepare my color, I'm going to go to a little bit of Indian red, or Venetian red, I'm sorry. And mix that with what's on my palette already, which is that cadmium red, New Gamboge. And I'm going to tone this one just down a little more earthy. right into the green and right along this side and that side. Because the only thing it needs is that extra volume, meaning I have light on one side, a little darker pigment on the other. These are interesting because they run off the page, so they barely need any help. Just a touch of color here, maybe here. And it is in that variation. And yes, there are these here that I forgot to add line to. But I'm going to now. Very simply put, I'm going to go outside of the color, make this a little bit rounder, and merge into kind of one shape. Maybe add one or two lines. And as I mentioned before, we come back and forth. I'm adding a different pattern of leaves here. And we will have to wait till that dries in order to come back in. For this one, I'm going to use a little bluer violet and just touch it on right where they meet. Soften up the edges, create that wet on wet technique. And there you have it. Beautiful carrots. I hope you enjoyed it.